An inspector calls, context and background. In English literature, when we study a novel, a play, or a poem, it is very important to understand the context or the background. Context or the background means the time and place when the text was written. And Inspector Calls was written in 1945. The writer's personal experiences, what we know about J B Priestley and why he wrote the play. The time and places in the text. An Inspector Call is set in 1912 in the North Midlands. An Inspector Calls by J B Priestley. J B Priestley was born in 1894 and died in 1984. He was very aware of the tremendous social and economic inequalities that existed in British society and wrote about these in his works. An Inspector Calls contains political, social, and ethic messages. J B Priestley wrote An Inspector Calls in 1945, and the play is set in 1912. In 1912, Britain was the wealthiest and the most powerful nation in the world. In the map below, the countries that are pink were ruled by Britain. By 1945, the USA and the Soviet Union were the two world superpowers. In the map below, the blue area represents USA influence and the red represents the Soviet Union. Britain was no longer a world power by 1945. At the beginning of the play, the Berlin family appear to be extremely powerful, but at the end, they are totally helpless. In 1945, the Labour Party promised to create a welfare state. This meant the British government would be responsible for all of its citizens from the cradle to the grave. The young, the old, the sick, and the vulnerable would be looked after by the state. Inspector Gould mentions in his powerful departing speech that we are all responsible for each other. By 1945, people no longer had to rely on family and friends or charities for help because it now was the responsibility of the government. We see what happens to Eva Smith when she was refused help by Mrs. Berlin's charity. An Inspector Calls was written in 1945, directly after the Second World War. The play is set in 1912. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, began with the gun and ended with the tank. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, began with the aeroplane and ended with the nuclear bomb. In 1945, the nuclear arms race began between the USA and the Soviet Union. If there would be a Third World War, it would lead to universal destruction. Before departing, the inspector ominously warns, the time will come soon when they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. On the 6th of August 1945, the USA dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. In 1 second, 80,000 people were killed and 90% of the city was destroyed. J B Priestley intentionally set An Inspector Calls in 1912 because this was an era when British society was completely different from when he wrote the play in 1945. In 1912, the class system and gender roles in Britain were rigid. However, by 1945, British society had completely changed and most people wanted a better life. In an Inspector Calls, J B Priestley encourages people to build a better society.